Hello and thank you for downloading. My name's Steve Johnson, and this is the Inquests and Inquiries podcast. Welcome to episode 6 of the Inquests and Inquiries podcast series. Today's episode is going to look at a number of inquiries and reports. In particular, this is going to follow the theme of flooding, a little bit like the health episode, and is going to look at the Boscastle, Carlisle and Hull flood reports, looking across a number of years from 2004 to 2015. Our artificial intelligence podcasters have analysed and absorbed into a large language model the 3 reports, and that is the basis of the analysis that will take place in the rest of this document. Notably here, I also asked the podcasters a specific question, which is, have things got better, or do the reports demonstrate that things were getting better between 2004 and 2015? And notably, it comes to the conclusion that while there have been improvements to emergency responses and community resilience since Boscastle in 2004, the severe flooding in Hull and Carlisle in 2007 and 2015 respectively indicates that things did not uniformly get better by 2015. In particular, it notes that there are recurring issues around communication, the need for better community engagement in planning, and the reality that infrastructure can still be overwhelmed by extreme weather events regardless of planning. In particular, there's a need for robust and well-timed and maintained infrastructure and a need for reliable and effective flood warning systems. So without further ado, let's hand over to the podcasters. Please remember the voices you hear now are not real humans. They are artificial intelligence podcasters based on a large language model. I hope you enjoy it, and please get in touch with any comments.
Welcome back, everyone. Ready for another deep dive?
Always.
Today, we're going to be knee-deep, actually maybe waist-deep, in flood response. We're looking at some UK case studies.
Fascinating stuff.
Yeah. We've got 3 specific floods we're going to unpack. Boscastle back in 2004.
Oh, yeah?
Carlisle 2015, and Hull 2007.
3 very different events.
Yeah.
3 very different locations.
Exactly. And that's what makes it so interesting, right? We can see how different factors play out in these really, really complex situations. And the best part, we've got these super detailed reports on each one.
Oh, these reports are gold mines.
They break down what worked, what didn't work, and more importantly, what we can learn, what we can do better next time.
The lessons learned are invaluable, not just for the UK, but for anyone dealing with flood response around the world.
Okay, so by the end of this deep dive, you'll be walking away with a much clearer picture of just how complicated flood response can be.
The challenges, the obstacles.
Yeah, the things those agencies on the ground have to deal with. Plus, and I think this is pretty cool, you might even pick up some insights about community resilience.
Oh, that's a big one.
Things you can actually apply in your own life, in your own community.
Building resilience is a team effort.
Okay, so let's set the scene, all right?
Let's do it.
First up, Boscastle, 2004. Picture this, a charming village right on the Cornish coast.
Beautiful spot.
Then boom, this unbelievable amount of rain falls in just a couple of hours.
We're talking billions of liters of water.
Billions, literally like over 1.4 billion. To give you an idea, that's enough to fill like over 550 Olympic swimming pools.
It's almost impossible to visualize.
It's mind-blowing. And all that water turns this usually peaceful little river, the River Valency, into this raging torrent.
Sweeping away cars, trapping people.
Yeah, residents, tourists, it was chaos.
And to make things even worse, Boscastle, it was a communications black spot.
Oh yeah, that was a major problem. Responders couldn't even get through to their control rooms.
Mobile phones barely worked.
Imagine that. You're in the middle of this disaster and you can't even call for help.
That communication breakdown had a huge impact on the response.
Absolutely. Okay, now fast forward to Carlisle in 2015. This one wasn't just heavy rain. We're talking record-breaking water levels on the River Eden.
Exceeding even those devastating floods they had in 2005.
And the thing is, it wasn't just Carlisle that got hit,
And
right?
the whole region was dealing with heavy rainfall.
So you've got all this water feeding into the River Eden. Resources were stretched thin.
Infrastructure overwhelmed.
It was a huge challenge trying to coordinate a response on that scale. And you guessed it, communication problems popped up again.
A recurring theme, unfortunately.
In the early hours, the police, they really struggled to get organized.
Coordination was hampered because those communication systems just failed.
And the report later highlighted some potential infrastructure issues, too. Like the railway embankments, they might have actually made the flooding worse.
Directing the floodwaters in ways that weren't helpful.
Okay, last but not least, Hull in 2007. This one's interesting because over 8,000 homes flooded. But it wasn't just the rain.
Right, it was a double whammy. Intense rain plus a complete drainage system failure.
Yeah, and as we'll see later, this wasn't some sudden unexpected thing. This is a cautionary tale.
About the choices we make, the investments we prioritize.
Exactly. It's about infrastructure, regulation, the whole economics of flood prevention. We can't just keep reacting to these floods. We have to be smarter. We have to be proactive.
Identify those vulnerabilities before they turn into disasters.
All right, let's dig a bit deeper into this whole communication chaos thing.
It's a recurring problem, and it's a serious one.
Back in Boscastle, those first responders, they were basically cut off.
Isolated.
The report actually says that the people in charge, they only really understood how bad things were because of the news on TV.
That's how they were getting their information.
Crazy, right? And it was because they relied on those traditional communication channels, radio, mobile phones.
Yeah.
But those systems, they just couldn't handle it.
They weren't resilient enough.
And Carlisle, not much better. They did issue warnings beforehand, but when the flood actually hit, the communication systems got overloaded.
They just couldn't cope with the volume of information.
And the result, the initial response was, well, let's just say it was a bit messy. It wasn't coordinated.
And what's even more concerning is that the report also found communication issues within the responding agencies themselves.
Oh, you mean they weren't talking to each other properly?
Yeah, in those first crucial hours, there were problems with coordination between different police departments.
So it's not just about communicating with the outside world. It's about making sure everyone on the inside is on the same page, too.
Absolutely. Internal communication is just as vital as external communication.
Okay, and what about Hull?
Well, Hull had these community wardens. They were absolute heroes out there on the front lines.
Yeah, they were doing amazing work.
But, and this is a big but, they didn't have any good way to relay that vital information back to the people making decisions.
To the command centers.
So they were seeing things, they were witnessing the situation firsthand, but they couldn't easily share what they were seeing.
That's got to be frustrating for everyone involved.
It really highlights the need for a multi-layered approach to communication. We need backup systems, redundant networks. We need to be exploring things like satellite phones for those key personnel.
So if one system fails, you've got another one ready to go.
Exactly. We need to be thinking about multiple scenarios, multiple ways to ensure that communication remains a strength, not a weakness, during these flood events.
These stories, they really drive home the point that communication is key. And when those systems break down, the consequences, they can be really serious, even tragic sometimes. We have to have robust, reliable communication.
Systems that can handle the pressure of a major flood. And it's not just about having them. It's about knowing how to use them, making sure they're part of the training, part of the culture.
Right, because a fancy piece of technology isn't going to do any good if nobody knows how to turn it on.
Preparation is key. Knowing what to do, knowing how to use the tools at your disposal.
Okay, but it's not all doom and gloom, right? I mean, these reports, they also had some pretty amazing stories about people showing incredible resilience, people who went above and beyond when faced with these disasters.
Oh, absolutely. Moments of extraordinary human compassion, even in the face of such immense challenges.
Like, for example, in Boscastle, there was this resident, right, just a regular guy, but he also happened to be an auxiliary Coast Guard.
So he had some training, some experience.
Yeah, and he was one of the first people to realize just how serious the flooding was. He didn't hesitate. He just immediately alerted the authorities. The report actually credits him with potentially saving lives.
A true local hero. His quick thinking and his understanding of the area were absolutely crucial in those early stages.
Talk about being in the right place at the right time and knowing what to do.
It's a powerful example of how individual initiative can make a real difference. That local knowledge, that instinct to act, it can have a ripple effect.
But even with people like him stepping up, the report also points out that there were some systemic issues too.
Areas where the response could have been even more effective.
Yeah, specifically, they found that there wasn't enough multi-agency training, especially at that strategic level, where decisions are made. So even though there were individuals who were ready and willing to help, the overall response, it wasn't as coordinated as it could have been.
which highlights the need for regular joint training exercises involving all the different agencies that would respond to a flood, simulating different scenarios, practicing that coordinated response.
So when the real thing happens, everyone knows what to do and they know how to work together.
Exactly. It's about building that muscle memory, that instinct for collaboration.
Now, in Carlisle, because the flooding was so widespread, resources are really stretched thin. But even with all the chaos, there were these amazing stories of community support.
Neighbors helping neighbors, volunteers showing up to lend a hand wherever they could.
The report really emphasizes this, the power of what they call social capital.
The strength of those community bonds, the trust that exists between people.
Yeah, and that's something that can really make a difference in a crisis, right? Knowing you can rely on your neighbors, knowing there are people who are going to have your back.
Absolutely. It's about building that sense of community, that shared understanding that we're in this together.
But again, the report also points to some potential infrastructure failures.
Reminding us that long-term resilience isn't just about people helping each other.
Right. We need to address those underlying vulnerabilities, those things that make these areas so susceptible to flooding in the first place.
It's about taking a holistic approach, looking at the bigger picture.
And finally, Hull. Again, incredible community spirit, people really coming together. But this is where it gets interesting. The investigation found that Yorkshire Water, the company responsible for the drainage system, they'd been warned repeatedly. Like for over a decade, they'd been told that the system wasn't adequate, and they basically ignored those warnings.
It raises some serious questions about accountability, about prioritizing short-term cost-cutting over long-term resilience. And it underscores the need for greater transparency, for make sure the public is informed and involved in these decisions.
It's almost unbelievable. They had all these warnings, and yet they didn't seem to act on them. It makes you wonder about the decision-making process. What were they thinking?
Well, in the case of Hull, they had actually invested in this huge infrastructure project, the Humbercare project. It was supposed to improve the city's sewage treatment.
So they were spending money, but it sounds like it backfired.
It seems that the changes they made actually reduced the system's capacity to handle those really heavy rainfalls.
So they spent £200 million to make their city more vulnerable to flooding. How does that even happen?
It's a stark reminder that even with good intentions, things can go wrong. And it highlights the need for thorough planning, for thinking about potential unintended consequences.
Especially with climate change and these more intense rain events.
We have to be adapting, we have to be thinking ahead.
So on one hand, we've got these inspiring stories of people stepping up, communities coming together. But on the other hand, we've got these recurring themes of systemic failures, communication breakdowns, warnings being ignored. It's like a tale of two cities, but for flood response.
And it emphasizes the fact that building resilience requires a multifaceted approach. It's not just one thing, it's about everything working together.
The infrastructure, the communication systems, the community engagement, the accountability. It's about creating a system that's prepared for those unexpected events, for those worst-case scenarios.
And it's about learning from the past, using these experiences to create a more resilient future.
These three floods, they offer valuable lessons not just for the UK, but for any community facing this growing threat of flooding.
By understanding what worked, what didn't work, we can take steps to mitigate those risks, to protect ourselves and our communities.
Knowledge is power, right?
Absolutely. And by sharing that knowledge, by learning from each other's experiences, we can work together to build a safer, more resilient world.
All right, so let's shift gears a little bit here.
Right.
Let's talk about what we can actually learn from all this, right? Because amidst all the chaos, all the things that went wrong, there are some really valuable takeaways here, things that can help us make things better in the future.
Oh, absolutely. These reports, they're not just about, pointing fingers or dwelling on the negative. They're about identifying those areas where we can improve. They actually offer some really concrete, actionable insights.
Yeah, and the need for robust communication systems, that's got to be top of the list, right?
It's a no-brainer.
We saw it in Boscastle, we saw it in Carlisle, we saw it in Hull. Communication breakdowns, they had a huge impact on all three floods. So what can we do? How do we make sure this doesn't keep happening?
Well, the reports, they recommend a multi-pronged approach. Basically, we need to attack this problem from different angles. Investing in those communication networks, making them more resilient, that's crucial, especially in those remote areas like Boscastle. And they also suggest exploring alternative communication methods.
So having backup options.
Exactly. Things like satellite phones for those first responders.
Yeah.
That could be a real game changer in situations where those traditional networks go down.
So it's not just about having the best technology, it's about having a plan B.
Right. We can't put all our eggs in one basket. We need to be prepared for those situations where things don't go as planned.
And it's not just about the technology itself, right? It's about the training, making sure that everyone knows how to use these systems effectively, especially when they're under pressure.
Absolutely. I mean, the most sophisticated piece of equipment in the world isn't going to do any good if people don't know how to use it in a real emergency situation.
It's like having a fire extinguisher and not knowing where it is or how it works.
Exactly. It's about being prepared, knowing that when things go wrong, you have reliable backup options, and you know how to use them.
Okay, another key takeaway, and we touched on this earlier, is that multi-agency training. You know, the Boscastle report, it was pretty clear that there was a lack of training, especially at that strategic level where all those different agencies, all those different groups are working together.
Yeah, trying to coordinate a complex response like that with people who've never actually worked together before, it's a recipe for disaster.
Exactly. You need to know who's doing what, who's in charge of what. You need to have those clear lines of communication and those smooth transitions between different agencies, because when a flood hits, you don't want to be wasting precious time figuring all that stuff out.
The reports, they really stress the importance of those joint training exercises where they simulate different flood scenarios and everyone's involved, the first responders, the local authorities, the government agencies. That way, everyone understands their roles and responsibilities in advance. They've practiced working together, they've built those relationships.
And it's not just about each group knowing what they're supposed to do, right? It's about practicing those transitions between different agencies, making sure those handoffs are smooth, that information is flowing. Because in a real flood situation, those minutes, they can make a huge difference.
Absolutely. Clear communication, smooth transitions, those are absolutely crucial for an effective response.
Okay, another point that came up again and again, and the whole report really highlights this, is the need for transparency and public engagement.
Yeah, it's not enough to just have those emergency plans in place. We need to make sure that the public is aware of them, that they understand the risks, and that they're actually involved in shaping those plans.
It's about more than just telling people what to do. It's about working with them, right? Making sure that the solutions we come up with, they actually work for the communities they're supposed to protect.
Exactly. Empowering communities to be active participants in building their own resilience. That's key, because when people are informed and they feel like they have a voice, they're more likely to be proactive, they're more likely to take ownership, they're more likely to trust those plans and follow them when the time comes.
And speaking of communities, the whole report also talks about the role of those community wardens.
Oh, they were amazing. They were really the unsung heroes of that flood response. Out there on the front lines, helping people, providing support, making a real difference.
But it seems like they weren't really given the tools or the training they needed to be as effective as they could have been.
Yeah, the report highlights the need to better equip and train these local champions, to really integrate them into those emergency response plans, give them the communication tools, the resources, the support they need to do their jobs effectively. Because they're the ones who are already there. They're the ones who know their communities best.
So we've got communication, we've got multi-agency training, we've got transparency, public engagement, empowering those local champions. These are all pieces of the puzzle, right?
Absolutely. They're all essential elements of building a more flood-resilient future.
And it's about shifting our mindset, isn't it? Moving away from just reacting to these events and towards anticipating them, preparing for them, being proactive, not reactive.
Precisely. It's about understanding that we can't just wait for a flood to happen and then try to pick up the pieces. We need to be thinking ahead, anticipating those risks, and taking steps to reduce their impact.
Okay, and speaking of proactive steps, let's talk about that drainage dilemma, because as we saw in Hull, ignoring those infrastructure problems can have devastating consequences. And it brings up this whole question of responsibility. Who's ultimately accountable for making sure that those drainage systems are adequate, that they're resilient?
Right? Is it the government? Is it the water companies? Is it the communities themselves? It's a complex issue. And the whole report, it seems to suggest that the way we're currently regulating these systems, it's not really cutting it. They talk about the limitations of that 1 in 30-year protection standard that's used for a lot of these drainage systems.
Yeah, I was wondering about that. Can you break that down for us a little bit? What does that even mean?
Sure. So that standard, it's based on historical rainfall data. Basically, it means that the system is designed to handle a rainfall event that has a 1 in 30 chance of happening in any given year.
So like a really heavy rainfall, but one that's not expected to happen very often.
Right. But the problem is that standard, it might not be adequate anymore, especially with climate change and the fact that we're seeing these more intense, more frequent rainfall events.
So it's like using an old map to navigate a new city.
Exactly. Those old standards, they're based on the past, but the climate, it's changing. And we need to make sure that our infrastructure, it's keeping up. We need to be designing for the future, not for the past.
So what's the solution here? Do we need to completely overhaul the regulations? Do we need to spend billions and billions of pounds upgrading drainage systems all over the country?
The reports don't offer a simple answer. It's a complicated issue with no easy solutions. But they do stress the need for a more holistic approach, for thinking long-term, for anticipating those future risks.
Right, it's about being proactive, about recognizing that these decisions we make today, they have consequences down the road.
And it's about understanding that drainage systems, they're not just pipes and pumps. They're critical lifelines for communities. And ensuring their resilience, it requires a coordinated effort. We need the government, we need the industry, we need the public all working together.
So it's about recognizing that flood prevention, it's an investment, not just an expense.
Exactly. Investing in resilient infrastructure today, it can save lives and money in the long run. It's about taking that long view, thinking about the bigger picture.
Okay, so we've talked about the big picture stuff, the infrastructure, the policies, the planning. But what about the individual? What can people do to protect themselves and their homes?
Oh, absolutely. Individual preparedness, it plays a huge role in reducing the impact of flooding. And there are things that everyone can do, starting with understanding their risk.
Knowing if you live in a flood-prone area.
Oh, exactly. You can visit the Environment Agency website, talk to your local council, find out what types of flooding you might be vulnerable to. Knowledge is power, and understanding your risk, it's the first step to taking action.
And then once you know your risk, you can start taking steps to mitigate it, right?
Absolutely. There are tons of resources out there that offer practical advice on how to protect your home from flooding. Simple things like installing flood barriers, moving valuable items to higher ground, having a plan in place for what to do in case of a flood. Those things can make a big difference.
And of course, don't forget about insurance.
Insurance is crucial. It might not prevent a flood, but it can help you recover financially if one does happen. It can make that process a little less stressful, a little less overwhelming.
The whole report also brought up this interesting point about the limits of relying solely on those large-scale infrastructure solutions. It really makes you think about individual preparedness, about those community-based solutions.
Yeah, it's about moving away from that mentality that someone else will take care of it and embracing that idea of self-reliance, of community resilience.
We've talked about communication breakdowns, about the unsung heroes of these flood events, about those drainage dilemmas, the importance of being prepared. What are your biggest takeaways from these reports?
You know, what really strikes me is that the lessons from Boscastle, Carlisle, and Hull, they go beyond the UK. They have implications for communities all over the world who are dealing with this increasing threat of flooding. It's a global issue.
And we can all learn from each other's experiences.
Exactly. By sharing knowledge, by sharing best practices, we can work together to build a more flood-resilient future. A future where these events, while they might be unavoidable, they don't have to be catastrophic.
So much to think about. I mean, we've seen the damage those floods can cause, how vital communication is in those emergency situations, and how important it is to be proactive, to plan ahead, to invest in infrastructure that can withstand these crazy weather events.
Yeah, but I think the real takeaway here, and I hope our listeners are really thinking about this, we tend to get fixated on that immediate response. When a disaster happens, how do we react? But true resilience, the kind that really safeguards communities for the long haul, that demands a different kind of thinking. It requires a shift in perspective.
It's about moving beyond just reacting to problems, right? It's about anticipating them, preparing for them, thinking ahead.
Exactly. And it's a call to action for everybody. Individuals, communities, even policymakers. We all have a part to play in creating a future where floods, they don't have to turn into these massive disasters.
So what can our listeners do? What actions can they take? How can they be part of that solution?
Well, I think it starts with asking yourself some questions. Could you be the person who helps their neighbor get their home ready for a potential flood? Could you be the one speaking up, advocating for better drainage systems in your community? Could you be that voice that ensures those critical communication channels stay open when they're needed most?
It's about recognizing that we can all make a difference, right? Even small actions, they can have a ripple effect.
Absolutely. It's about being part of the solution, not waiting for someone else to fix the problem. It's about taking ownership, taking responsibility.
Well, this deep dive, it's been eye-opening, to say the least. And I think it's clear that we all have a role to play in building a more flood-resilient future. Thanks for joining us on this journey. We hope you'll keep exploring, keep learning about these issues.
Because as we've seen, knowledge is the foundation of preparedness.
And that's a wrap on another deep dive. We'll catch you next time.
Thank you for listening to the Inquests and Inquiries podcast. Remember, you can find more information on the website, inquestsandinquiries.com, or on the YouTube channel as well. Link in the notes.